For the LRPC, we need longevity because it's a lot of information that builds on itself. For the DAC, it might be, they're different is what I'm saying.
I
So
think
we
it's
can-
really important to take
Is
a
that,
look
that's green,
at
right?
the-
Just noting that that is green in the ceiling.
I was looking, it's really pretty.
All right.
It's always good if we keep that.
All right, ladies and gents. For those of you that are live streaming, this is a board work session. And this is, oops, we're also going to be calling in Director Chancho Shore, who's stuck in traffic right now.
Hello.
Hey, Chancho Shore, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
All right. Yes, we can hear you lovely as well, so that's perfect. Yeah, I was just opening up our work session, and I know Graziano will not be here. I have not heard from Director Lung whether he'll be running in momentarily or not. But as you guys know, this is really a time for us just to have some good conversation. We have Erica Mason here from our curriculum department, and Matt Reynolds, our chief officer for data assessment system officer for our district. And so we're looking forward to learning from them, but also the intent of this is for us to have interactive conversation about the things we're going to learn tonight and to broaden our understanding of not only performance, but also some specific areas that we want to look at in terms of math as well. So we will work together for about an hour, 15 minutes, and that's pretty much our purpose for tonight. So Dr. Tucker, I don't know if you've got any opening words, otherwise we'll turn it over to Matt.
Well, this is mostly going to be about Matt and Erica. We're pleased to have this adequate time to that the board has provided to discuss the district's performance frameworks data today. It feels good to have this time, and we're not constrained to a short time period that we would normally have in a regular board meeting. So thank you for this beautiful gift of time. Matt is going to kick us off and sort of give us some historical background on these frameworks. He's really going to get into the discussion of data. And I've done a little history regarding assessment, because what we're really talking about is assessment, the third leg of a three-stool of curriculum. The written curriculum we've spent a long time talking about, and we'll continue to talk about state academic content standards. The top assessment, which is extremely important, is what our teachers present before our children, and then the assessed curriculum. And so now we're looking at the data. Matt's going to talk about that. Erica certainly will have some comments. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of assessment here in Colorado. Matt?
So, just if I interrupt, I failed to acknowledge Ted Knight, our assistant superintendent at the table as well, and Director Lung has arrived also, so thank you. Matt?
Perfect. I thought it'd be a great opportunity to give a little bit of a historical background. Right now we're transitioning to new standards, and so I wanted to give a little bit of historical background on where we are and how we got here regarding our academic standards. And this really goes back to CAP4K, which is Colorado's Achievement Plan for Kids. And so this is kind of the historical from the last two sets of standards. In 2008 and 9 is really when they revised the standards to align with Common Core state standards. And those were implemented in 2011 and 13. And so we've been transitioned into those standards. And our latest and greatest, we actually have 2 rounds of implementation. 21 next year is when we do most of our standards, except for science, because they've transitioned to next generation science standards. They've given an additional year, so they will follow suit with that. So the context of having new standards in place every few years, as a matter of fact, they've reaffirmed that it's every 6 years that we revise our standards. That's context that's important to us because as they make revisions to standards, we have to change and adapt to what's new. At the same time, this is where the slide gets really busy. These are the assessment changes that have occurred, really the big ticket items. There's been changes that are not outlined in here. But we have gone from what started off as CSAP, which is the Colorado Student Assessment Program, to TCAP, to PARC, to now CMAS. We did that in a matter of 20 years. that many different assessment changes, and then modifications in between, namely to introduce ACT, and then not introduce it, but move to SAT in the middle of that. So the context of these changes from what the content academic standards are calling for and what we're actually being assessed is really important when we start looking at trend data. It becomes an interesting challenge for us to do correlative data from one year to the next because they change. Accountability, this is the most recent Accountability Act, which was passed in 2009. You guys have seen this slide a ton of time for me. I step to the podium usually talking about accountability, but it issues performance frameworks for our districts and schools. And the State Board of Education is the one that makes those recommendations on those assignment types. Big ticket items in terms of what those performance frameworks contain. There's really three different post-secondary workforce readiness. That data, which we'll look at here in just a second, they come together to create a formal score for schools and for districts. The state identifies these metrics, and they do change, which we saw this fall, and we'll talk about some of those changes for the fall and for the spring. And this is a little bit more granular in terms of what data goes into each one of these categories. So for academic achievement, you're talking CMAS and PSAT. Growth, it's about looking at language arts and math for CMAS, as well as PSAT to SAT. Post-secondary, I've just listed a few of them there. There's SAT, dropout, graduation, and matriculation rates. All of that data comes together to form a score for our schools and for our district. In addition to that, they have a color scheme, and I'll spend a whole lot of time talking about this color scheme. The general rule of thumb, green is good. And so when you get the piece of paper in front of you, green is good. That's usually the one thing that I want people to walk away from my conversation is when you look at a performance framework, green is good. Districts add an additional category called the distinction. They wanted to add that to schools but have refrained from doing so. But generally speaking, green is good. Participation due to opt-outs is also something that we have to consider. That's mainly because of federal accountability. The federal government does not acknowledge parent excusals, but our state does. And so when we look at our assignments, we have to indicate both the rating and the participation descriptor.
And that participation indicator, if you will, or descriptor we are using here in Colorado, as Matt stated, is a federal government requirement originally left behind, and it was maintained under PASA, in which the goal is that in some states, if you don't report card or an indicator on the report card is missing.
Yes. And ours would get that if we don't document parent excusals accurately. But as long as we document that, we're okay. This is our current framework that was approved last semester. Our district is accredited with low participation. Again, green is good. And our total point value is 66.9. That point value may look familiar because we were in that same position 2 years ago, and we'll talk about what that looks like. This is a breakdown by level. You'll see that across the board we have one category, which is achievement for high school, that's not green, and we'll actually talk about that as part of our data dive today. But across all categories overall, we're accredited for elementary, middle, and high. This is our trend data over the last 4 years. We've gone from 66-ish to 70 back to 66 over time. And the threshold for the blue category is 74 total points, which is something that we flirt with pretty much every year. And this is our comparative districts on where they sit in regards to their performance, as well as if we compare them to that cut score to see where they are for Littleton, Jeffco, Denver, Cherry Creek, and APS. In terms of schools, 92% of our schools have a performance plan type. We have 6% that are in improvement, 1% which constitutes one school in priority improvement. And we do have one school that has insufficient data. That would be our online school. They have such a small population that it's hard for them to get enough data to actually get a rating. So they have that insufficient rating category. And here's the last couple years as a frame of reference. 2 years ago, we were at 84. Last year, we were at 93. And last year, we had a few more schools in that orange category. So we've moved those schools to a different category this year. The other thing that we do pay attention to, and we had a celebration, if you recall, back in December, these are our awards. And this is the trend data for our awards over the last 4 years for both distinguished growth and excellence awards, as well as high school growth. You'll see year over year, we've increased that number of total awards from the last 4 years to today. A few things that I do want to talk about, and we'll see it actually in the data. And I'm going to pass around the actual district performance framework. But 3 things that you'll hear me talk about when it comes to our performance is participation does matter. And our participation is something that we have been monitoring ever since they've allowed excusals, because it makes it to interpret data if the excusals are really high. So I took a snapshot of the participation rates. You can see there's a dramatic dip in science, and that's primarily at the high school level, where we only have 22% of our kids participating in that exam, which does make it really difficult for us to interpret that data. Another context that's really important is we've got new Colorado academic standards in play, which means next year when we start looking at our data, we're transitioning to more items that are aligned to those new standards. And so that's something that we're monitoring as we move through this transition. And high school changes. We have several high school changes that I do want to spend some time on that would help us understand a little bit about that decrease from our overall of 70 back down to 66. The state made some changes on how they scored certain elements within high schools, and it impacted all of our high schools. And it actually impacted almost 70% of all districts across the state in a negative fashion. Districts across the state went down because of those changes. So, yes.
The accountability participation rate, I'm not sure I understand.
Great question. Save that till we get into it, but we'll do it right now because it's a good time to do it, because I can see it up on the screen. So you have 2 different columns for participation. The first one, which is the middle column there, where it just says participation rate, that's the federal participation rate. That's the raw data for how many students are available and how many actually took the test. The accountability participation excludes parent excusals. So they take that the excusal list and they remove that group of students. And from a state perspective, they do not hold us accountable to parent excusals. So that number in the accountability metric has to be over 95%. And I'm happy to report that we're consistently over that 95%. Our schools do an awesome job of documenting all of those excusals. As you can see, there's over 4,000 of them for English and math, and they document every single one of those, where we're only off by less than 1% on all of the student count, which is incredible from our schools. Great question.
So is there a reason that science, the excuse given by parents, what is the difference with science versus the other subjects?
Great question. Science is only tested at grade 5, 8, and 11, and at grade 11, not many kids take the test. And in terms of reasons, they don't necessarily give us a reason on why they're excusing. For students, it's not applicable to them. They don't see the value of this test. It's not like SAT, that there's a direct line to their college. There's just no incentive for them, that's their own words, to take the test. And so we see a dramatic drop in participation. As you grow older in age for students, they hit 11th grade science and it plummets. They just do not see the value of that test.
Also, it's been, in some parts of the country, a cultural norm going into the opt-out movement as well. So
I was just trying to figure out why